All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Great to see people coming in for this webinar with our special guests from Canada, the UK, and the United States. We've had some wonderful response to this webinar, lots of interest from all three countries. I'm really excited to talk about PR today. We're just waiting, giving people a couple of minutes to come in before we introduce ourselves. Wow, great to see so many people joining us. Thanks for joining the webinar on proportional representation. So as people come in, I'd just like to remind you to, you can chat with other people who are watching the webinar in the chat. So the chat's a great place to say hi and where you're from. And if you have questions for the panelists, then I'd encourage you to put those in the question and answer box. So again, talking with others who are watching the webinar goes in the chat, and questions for the panelists go in the Q&A. And we will have someone from one of the orgs in the chat as well to help you out if you're have any special questions or having any technical difficulties. Great to see people still arriving. Welcome to the webinar. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes. The chat is disabled. Everybody's telling me the chat is disabled. Can you look into that? Oh, now it's enabled, says Ehab. I'm seeing some familiar names here. Hello to the folks from Canada.
Anita, while we wait for people to come in, do you have a sense of the breakdown of where people are coming to the event today?
You would have to ask Paladin because they're actually hosting this Zoom meeting and I have no idea for the first time.
No.
There's a broad participation across 3 countries. I'd say it's actually relatively even.
Good.
Oh, great.
I was going to say, don't make this into a competition.
No,
USA,
exactly.
USA.
Just want a proportional representation of everyone.
Oh, here we go.
That's right.
Well, then the US is going to get all these seats because we have so many people.
That's by population, Lee. That's different, remember? Separate issue. All right. So I'm still seeing the numbers go up. I'm going to give it just about less than 1 more minute, and then we're going to get started because we only have an hour today. Welcome to everyone who's joining us for this webinar on proportional representation in Canada, the US, and the United Kingdom. Glad to see so many people joining, and there will be a recording of this webinar afterwards. Wonderful to see people coming in from 3 countries. So many shared problems and shared values that we're going to talk about today on the webinar. All right, so I'm going to get going now. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us on this webinar on our democratic future with our special guests from the United Kingdom, from the USA, and from Canada. My name is Anita Nickerson. I'm the Executive Director of Fair Vote Canada. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that we are, myself, those in Canada, are on the, obviously around the world as well, are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities. These lands have been inhabited by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. I myself live in Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, and I'm on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. So this is a special webinar for us. We are joined by our allies from the ProRep Coalition in California and Make Votes Matter in the UK. The United States, Canada, and the UK all use winner-take-all voting systems for their legislatures in recent years. They have all had serious problems with their winner-take-all systems and the kind of democracy that's creating. They've had unique challenges and some common issues. Today, we're going to talk about how transitioning to PR can help address these issues and what the paths are for each country to get there. So we're thrilled to be co-sponsoring this webinar with 2 organizations, and this is a first, I think, for all 3 of our organizations. So I want to introduce my co-hosts here, co-sponsors for the webinar I'll be hosting. So first, the ProRep Coalition in California. Shout out to their executive director that you can see on the screen there. That's Paladin Myers, who really championed this webinar collaboration. You can check out their website at ProRepCoalition.org, and they are the grassroots campaign for PR in California. Our second co-sponsor is a longtime ally of ours in the United Kingdom. That's Make Votes Matter. I'd encourage you to check out their website. And, you know, when Make Votes Matter started around 2016, it was really great for us because it was like, oh my goodness, there's something that's the equivalent of Fair Vote Canada has launched in the United Kingdom. So all our orgs really are powered by volunteers and by passionate people. So after the webinar, when you log off, you're going to land on a page that's inviting you to donate to the organization in your country. If you can't do that, if you'd like to get involved as a volunteer, we encourage you to contact the organization in your country because we are powered by you. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists today. So we have three special guests with us. I'll start with Dennis Pilon, who is in Canada with me. He is a professor of political science at York University, and he is, I would say, Canada's top electoral reform expert. He has written dozens of journal articles, newspaper articles, book chapters in 2 books, including The Politics of Voting, Reforming Canada's Electoral System, and Wrestling with Democracy, Voting Systems as Politics in the 20th Century West. We also have Hina Bokhari, and I'm really excited to have Hina here because she actually works in a legislature that uses proportional representation. So she can tell us how it actually really works. So Hina was first elected to the London Assembly for the Liberal Democrats in 2021. She was subsequently elected to the Assembly to chair the Fire Committee through 2024 and is the first ethnic minority woman to lead a group on the London Assembly. Hina has always been keen to ensure the widest range of communities are involved in decision-making across London. She spearheaded efforts to encourage ethnic minority groups to engage more in the political process and has been relentless in making the case for electoral reform in the United Kingdom. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that as they've just had an extremely disproportional election. And finally, we have Lee Drutman, who I'm thrilled to have on because we've wanted to have him on a webinar for at least 2 years now. So Lee is the author of Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, the case for multi-party democracy in America. And don't we need that right now with the US election coming up? That's so obvious. He is a senior fellow at the think tank New America, a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, the co-host of the podcast Politics in Question, the co-founder of Fix Our House. And I would encourage you to check out Fix Our House, the campaign for PR in the US. He is the co-founder of the Center for Ballot Freedom, which advocates for fusion voting. He writes the newsletter Undercurrent Events. So we're thrilled to have all three guests with us today. So this is a short 1-hour webinar, and so I'm going to try to move things along so we all get the most out of it. We will be putting 3 questions to each of the panelists. They'll have 3 or 4 minutes to answer each question. Then during the last 15 or 20 minutes, we will take some of your questions that you can put in the question and answer box. Keep in mind that probably will have time for only 1 or 2 questions on this short webinar. So I'm going to start with the first question. And the first question is, all right, what issues has the use of winner-take-all elections created in your country? So I'm going to start this one with Dennis, and then we'll go to Lee, and then we'll go to Hina. So Dennis, what issues has winner-take-all created in Canada?
Well, I may be uncharacteristically brief because, of course, I've written a whole book on this topic, and I encourage anyone who wants to dive deeper into the minutiae of it. You can find all of my published work on my Academia EDU site. You just Google Dennis Pilon. It's like the first or second thing that comes up. And the book, in fact, is available there for free. And so you can rehearse all these different arguments. But if we pull together, what are the greatest hits of the problems with first past the post for Canada? Well, the most obvious is misrepresentation of political opinion. And here people often look at smaller parties or new parties, but it's not just the smaller parties who are misrepresented. Even the bigger parties are misrepresented. We find that our right-wing party lacks representation in the city centers. The smaller, more urban-based parties have support in rural areas, but they can't elect anyone. So everyone's actually getting misrepresented under first past the post. In Canada, we have a particular problem with the over-regionalization of our party system. Our party results make us look much more regional than we are. Quebec looks like it's all for leaving the country, and the West is all for beating up on Quebec. But when you drill down into the results, that's not actually what the voters said. In fact, a majority of Westerners have a much more nuanced position on Quebec, and a majority of Quebecers have always voted or supported parties that wanted to renew their relationship with Canada. So the regionalization issue is an issue between East and West, but also between rural and urban. Wasted votes, obviously, is an issue. Everyone will talk about that. Nearly half, sometimes more than half of the votes don't contribute to the election of anyone. Poor representation of social diversity. We fall low on women's representation and just about everything else. The system is slow to respond to new demands, and yet at the same time, we suffer from policy lurch, where a party with slightly more support than another party comes in and wipes out everything they did. Then they get defeated, and the next party comes in and destroys everything that was accomplished there. And the last thing I'll mention for now is that our system has led to an inflated partisanship, where there really is no incentive to work across party lines, except when there's a minority government. But even there, it's not as stable as it would be under a PR system, because every party has to judge when to stop working together in that minority government situation. The problem with winner take all is that you're fighting every single inch of territory for every single vote. You can't turn around and say to your opponent, hey, you had a good idea, because that might defeat you. So that the incentives of the system are all against a constructive engagement across our differences.
Thank you, Dennis. You covered a lot of ground in a very, very short time, and we're living it right now in Canada. Our parliament has been in a gridlock for about 12 days now, where nothing's getting done except they're yelling at each other. Anyway, okay. So we're going to move on now to Lee and have you answer the question: what issues has the use of winner-take-all voting created in the United States?
So it's a lot of the same issues. Regionalization of parties, check. We have an urban party and a rural party because Democrats no longer compete for rural small town voters, and Republicans no longer compete for urban and professional suburban voters. And that trend has been exacerbated tremendously as our politics have nationalized over the last several decades. Wasted votes, check. We're having an election here in a few weeks, but the election is really only going to be held in a handful of states and a handful of congressional districts. About 90% of congressional districts are effectively uncompetitive because of winner-take-all elections. So it comes down to these narrow swings. Inflated partisanship. We have an intense problem of hyper-partisan polarization in this country. And we also have the unique problem of one Donald Trump, who, despite being very openly anti-liberal, is still supported by half of the country because the other half of the country is Democrats. And if you're a longtime Republican, you can't possibly vote for a Democrat. So this binary two-party system that is supported and sustained by winner-take-all elections, nationalization of politics, increasing culture war, conflicts, narrow margins, has just created this incredibly toxic environment of escalating nastiness, which Donald Trump has come to really embody. I don't think in any other politics could a politician like Donald Trump have risen. And people on the Republican side are willing to accept, put up, even enthuse over this vitriolic fascist rhetoric, because we're in a zero-sum conflict. This is a real problem, and so and without change to our electoral system, it's hard to see how this resolves. We've been in a 50-50 back and forth for decades now, and it keeps getting nastier every election after election. I think there's a lot more ideological diversity. We're a very big country, very diverse country, but all of it gets smushed in to these two Procrustean coalitions that are just held together by their opposition to each other. And the closing argument of every election is you can't vote for the other side. Whatever disagreements you have, the other side is a threat to this country. And trust in institutions, faith in the system are just plummeting. The basic bargain of democracy is a system in which parties are able to lose elections. Parties can lose elections, and it's okay. And I don't think we have that anymore in the U.S., thanks to the two-party system and our winner-take-all zero-sum elections.
Thank you, Lee. It's hard to sum up the problems in 3 or 4 minutes, isn't it? Yeah, I
wrote a whole book on it as well.
Exactly. I really appreciate Lee bringing up the polarization. We're seeing a lot of that here in Canada. The United States is not an island unto itself, and it's sort of that problem is infecting a lot of countries, particularly with winner-take-all voting systems. All right, now I'd like to ask Hannah, what issues has winner-take-all voting created in the United Kingdom?
Well, you'll be pleased to know I did not write a book about this subject, but I have experienced it from the actual experience of being in an election, both in the first past the post and also proportional representation. And this system that is, first past the post for the general election has really created a real lack of trust in politics. And there's been a lot of discussion in Britain about the fact that there is a lack of trust in politics and politicians. And that then in turn means that there's a lower turnout for elections, which is a real problem for our democracy. And I'm here to represent Make Votes Matter. But for me, that means make every voice matter. And the crucial issue for us is to make sure that everyone feels heard. And one of the things that I think is so tragic about our electoral system right now is the low turnout does tend to be from minority groups. The ethnic minority groups tend to be the groups of people that are less likely to vote. And yet they are the ones who are impacted mostly by the decisions that are made by the government of the day. And this is a real problem. If we want engagement from ethnic minorities, from young people, from disabled Londoners, all of these groups who are impacted by decisions that are going to really impact their lives, everyday lives, and they're not taking part in the process to get the people elected who could actually represent them better. And this is a real problem. It also means that there's a lack of incentive to vote because they think, what's the point? My voice doesn't matter. If I vote, the party that I want won't get elected. The views that I want won't be represented in the politicians. They don't really care about what I think. And I think this has been a massive problem for our politics. I represent the Liberal Democrat Party. We are a party that have always fought for proportional representation, but we're in a two-party system where the Labour or the Conservatives win in the general elections mostly. We've only managed to get into a coalition through bizarre moments in history that kind of created that position, but generally it's very, very difficult for us to win. And what we've had to try and do is play the game. And that's just not right. We shouldn't have to play the system to win seats. We have managed to now significantly increase our seats in the general election with 72 MPs, but we didn't go up very much by our percentage, only about 1% higher than the previous election, which is completely bizarre considering that really at the end of the day, what we should be doing is reflecting how people vote. And if we were really to reflect how people think and feel, we'd have a completely different system. And now we have a government that's been elected on 33% of the national vote. It's absolutely bizarre. And that's why people just think, well, you know, in this system, is there really any point? And we have a battle on our hands to make people want to vote. And if we had a better system, we can do that.
Thank you, Hannah. That's a wonderful overview. And I just want to reinforce what Hannah sort of started with, which is, you know, we sometimes get all caught up in the math and parties and stuff, but this is really about real people and policies that affect people's lives. And, you know, one of the interesting things from New Zealand when they switched is that different kinds of people started to come out to vote. People that weren't coming out before, that Hannah has alluded to, were the ones that started showing up because now their vote made a difference. So those are sort of subtle but really important effects. So I'm going to move on to the second question. And for this one, we will start with Lee, then Hannah, then Dennis. Okay, so the second question, this is sort of the flip side of this. In which ways would proportional representation help address these issues in your country? Okay, and we will start with Lee.
Well, I think if the U.S. moved to a proportional voting system, and one thing you'd see is that votes would matter everywhere. So rather than just a handful of these swing districts that are competitive where billions of dollars get poured in, you'd see votes mattering throughout the country for legislative elections. The Electoral College is a different thing that we can come back to, but at least for the legislature, you'd see votes matter, and you'd see more voters being engaged. I think one thing that is pretty consistent throughout the literature on turnout is that voting countries that have proportional voting systems have higher turnout because more votes matter. There are more parties and candidates reaching out to voters, and there are just more choices for voters, more likelihood that they find somebody that they're actually excited to vote for rather than voting for the lesser of two evils. We've discussed that issue. So I think that would improve. The U.S. has a distinct problem with gerrymandering, which, you know, we can't even figure out how to have independent commissions, unlike our Anglo cousins, which at least with elections Canada and then the UK, you don't have that problem, although you have problems of many uncompetitive elections. But this would end gerrymandering, which is a huge problem in U.S. elections, and it would, fundamentally, I think, break what I've called the two-party doom loop, this escalating binary of our two parties, competing for these narrow margins, and bring a system that could really represent the diversity of this country. And I mean diversity across many dimensions: ideological, policy diversity, lived experience diversity, ethnic and racial diversity. And the idea that we have this country of almost 350 million people and we fit them into these just two and only two bins is absolutely crazy. And so many people feel unrepresented in the U.S. system. So many people feel like there's nobody who is speaking for them, and they just feel disenchanted and frustrated and against the status quo. And elections keep going back and forth on this. Lesser of two evils, which just is fundamentally preventing people from connecting to a more positive vision of what is possible. So I think we'd see more positive politics. I think we'd see better turnout. We'd see an end to gerrymandering. And the U.S. also suffers from a gerontocracy, as you may have noticed distinctly. And I think proportional democracies are better on age representation as well, because it's possible for new parties to form that bring in a new generation of voters rather than people having to wait their turn in these single seats. As we know, proportional systems are better for gender balance, better for minority representation. So I think we'd have a legislature that looks a lot more like the country across all of these dimensions. And I think that would begin to restore some of the faith that Americans have in our political system. More engaged, better representation, less toxic binary politics. Count me in.
Thank you, Lee. That was great. I wanted to just pick up on what Lee was saying about age representation. And one of the most interesting pieces of research I've seen is showing how many more youth parliamentarians, like youth representatives, there are in legislatures that are elected by proportional representation. And for countries that have really low voter turnout among youth, that would be just so exciting to see. So I want to move on now to Hina. In which ways would proportional representation help address the issues in your country?
Well, for one, we would no longer have safe seats. We've got a real problem in this country where we have politicians who are elected election after election after election, who are doing very little to represent their constituents. There is a situation where we have, and I'm going to be frank, lazy politicians. Politicians who don't knock on your door, who don't have surgeries, who don't engage, who don't listen. And this is incredibly poor for our political system. This is, no surprise that people don't want to bother voting if it doesn't make any difference in these particular areas where you've got safe seats. It also, it frustrates me because I know of a couple of politicians who are in safe seats who have admitted to me that they don't even take their job very seriously. Now, what does that mean for our politics if we've got people like that representing us? I also think that what PR will address is some of those issues that I talked about in terms of diversity, increasing the vote share, but also progressive politics. If we had a system that allowed for the different voices to come through, we probably would be seeing more rights for disabled residents. We probably would see a change in the way we see asylum seekers and refugees in our country right now, who are some of the most persecuted people in our country right now. Gypsy and Roma communities as well, who hardly have any say in our political system, would have more of a voice. And recently, we have seen an interesting movement within the Muslim voters within our country and how they've been voting. And I think that's been really, really fascinating to see how the first past the post system did. It kind of encouraged Muslim voters to think differently about how they were going to vote. A lot of people were talking about Gaza and the situation in the Middle East. And what I think PR would have done was made sure that those voices were heard. And what ended up happening, there was a real way, again, playing the system, that there was an interesting situation where we've got now 4 independent MPs that have just been recently elected. But they had to play the system. Now, if we had a fairer system where there was PR, those voices would have been heard. We would have seen maybe movement towards having, and this is a bold statement to make, but even maybe a movement to having more progress in getting peace in the Middle East and moving faster in really some tough situations that we're having to deal with in politics. If we had more voices, perhaps we'd be moving faster in these really important international issues that we're facing right now.
Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, I think you're sort of alluding to what Lee was talking about too, just how winner take all polarizes every single issue. So there can't be very good discussion across party lines and to resolve differences. And I just want to reiterate what Hannah was saying about safe seats. Here in BC, we just had an election, and I'm pretty sure one of the candidates said that a party could run Kermit the Frog in one of those ridings, and that same party would would have won. So I think we all have those similar problems. So I'm going to move on to Dennis now and ask him to reflect on in which ways would proportional representation help address the issues in your country.
What I'd like to do is develop some of the points that the other speakers have mentioned, because really a PR system creates a different environment for policymaking. I remember the Prime Minister of the Netherlands was interviewed once about how they get things done. This is back, I think, in the 80s. And he admitted, it takes us a little longer, to get things done. But he said, by the time we've worked up a policy, we've heard from everybody. And we've built the support. And what that means is that the policy has legs. It means that it's got some roots in the community, which ultimately means the policies will work better. When you've got a government that's elected on 33% of the popular vote, they are going to be weak. It's going to be difficult for them to deliver on what they promised when they have so little support in the broader community. And that's just, it's not a good way to do things. It's not an effective way to govern and make policy. So this leads to my main point that I've always reflected on in the parliamentary systems, which is that proportional representation breaks the back of phony majority governments. Because that is really the origin of a lot of our problems. A lot of our problems is that a party with 40% of the popular vote can win 60 or 70% of the seats and then ram through whatever stuff they want and disregard what anybody else wants for as long as they can hang on to their term. And with a majority of seats, that's usually a long time, usually the full time of four years. So PR strikes right at the most problematic part of first past the post is these unearned majority governments. And by extension, then it strikes at that because every vote would count towards something that voter wanted. Now, of course, if you're supporting the monster raving loony party, you're probably not going to get a representative, even with PR. So I'm not suggesting everybody's going to get everything. You got to vote for parties that, have some popularity in the community. But when we look at the major parties, the parties that get, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of votes in a PR system, we would see a much better reflection of those numbers and where that support is. So the parties themselves would be much more diverse, as well as having a more diverse range of parties. And that would be crucially important in Canada, where we are struggling with regional economic issues, ethnic issues, immigration issues, language issues, French and English. I mean, there's just so many things, Indigenous politics. We've got so many things that we have to try to put into our policy mix. And PR would allow us to get a better balance. Get everybody at the table. To me, that's really the lesson of PR, is that everybody gets up at the table, then we make some decisions. I mean, at the end of the day, you still have to make decisions, and maybe then it's going to be majority rule, but it's going to be a real majority rather than the phony majorities that we have now. It would reduce party, regional, and social polarization. Just factually, it would reduce it because it wouldn't amplify what are now completely unrepresentative regional results in Canada. I mean, Alberta looks like a one-party state of conservatism, when in fact, just a few years ago, they elected a left-wing NDP government. So there's clearly quite a bit of both trends, left and right, in Alberta, but you'd never know it looking at our federal election results because the Conservatives consistently mop up nearly all the seats in the province. And that's first past the post at work. And finally, a PR system would create incentives for genuine cooperation between different parties and politicians to work together because they'd be rewarded for doing it. In PR systems, when we look at the trajectory of politics over the last 100 years in Western Europe, where they've used PR, we have seen considerable cooperation across party lines because it's not winner take all. It's precisely because every vote will count. And we often see in the Western European context, voters rewarding parties that work effectively together and punishing parties that are grandstanding and just trying to, make hay with wedge politics. And so those are the key things that I think a PR system would do to dramatically alter the way politics works in Canada.
Thank you, Dennis. And I think that that's what most voters want. I mean, one time we put out a national poll asking people if they wanted to see parties cooperate across party lines in the public interest, and about 97% of people said, yes, that's exactly what we want, but we're not going to get there with first past the post. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last question for our panelists, and we're going to start with Hannah, then Dennis, then Lee. What opportunities for reform are available in your country? Is there a route to adopting proportional representation nationally?
Well, we have just had the most disproportional election in Britain, and it really does highlight the problems that we have. I mean, I was saying earlier about 33% of our percentage to the current Labour government. They only increased by 1%, but they went up 411 seats, which was an increase of 211 from 2019, just because of a 1% increase in their vote share. And this is really bizarre as well, that the fact that they had less votes per seat. The Conservatives actually ended up having to work harder. They ended up having to get over 56,000 votes per seat to win. And the Liberal Democrats only needed less than them, 48,000 per seat. It was absolutely bizarre in the way the seats were won, and then according to the number of votes. The other thing that I found absolutely fascinating, this is the first time since the creation of the Liberal Democrat Party, my party, in 1988, that their number of votes were per seat was lower than the Conservative Party as well. So this is not right. This was so strange, and I think because of that, there's a lot of movement within even the current MPs that have just been elected to see change. Now, we've got 72 Liberal Democrat MPs, that every single one of them, despite having won through the first past the post system, want PR. And we are pushing for it. There are also the Labour MPs who are also really, really supportive of it. And interestingly, even Conservative MPs who've seen the light now of having lost so dramatically in this last election. So lost a lot of seats and so massively. So I think there is time for change now. There are lots of parliamentarians who want to see this happen. And as you mentioned earlier about me getting elected as well, I am elected on proportional representation. There is already examples throughout Britain where PR works. And it creates a diversity amongst the people who are elected, collaborative politics. It means that we can work together on issues, and there's a lot of agreement as well, which pushes forward those progressive ideas that we want. I do think that we're on our way to getting some change, and it doesn't need to be done through any dramatic way. We don't need a referendum. We've done that in this country, but that's not needed. And we've seen electoral change happen without it. It happened with the recent change to our own Mayor of London elections that happened without any referendum. People weren't asked about it. It just happened. So a royal commission could be used in our country. There's no reason why that can't work. And we're very hopeful that this will be the last election based on first past the post. Fingers crossed.
Thank you, Hannah. That's really, really hopeful. Thanks for that. All right, then we're going to go to Dennis. What opportunities for reform are available in your country, and is there a route to adopting PR nationally?
Well, I feel a bit overqualified to answer this question because, of course, I wrote a book that looked at 18 countries over 150 years. So I looked at every single instance of national voting system reform. So I've got a little bit of background on how just about everybody got the voting system that they did. And of course, it's a fascinating story of betrayal and hopes and dreams. I mean, it's cinematic, in its qualities. But the basic thing is that voting systems have been mostly an elite design, introduced either through complete control over the political system or amidst kind of social chaos and fear. But what is telling is that things like referendum are very, very rare. Only 2 countries in the Western world have introduced voting systems at the national level by a referendum, and that's Switzerland in 1918, and then more recently New Zealand in the 1990s. Almost every Western country where they've made a change has done it through cooperation between parties. Parties say, okay, whether it's an ideal movement or a self-interested one or a bit of both, the facts are that's the way that these countries have gotten these systems that they have. So in the Canadian context, what's our best hope? Well, the best hope would be minority government. We have seen a succession of minority governments. In fact, Canada kind of stands out amongst Commonwealth nations with the number of minority governments or hung parliaments, as they call them in the UK. Whereas it's much less common in Australia or New Zealand or the UK. So these minority governments are an opportunity to try to push the envelope. But, often there's resistance from the two national parties, the two parties that have dominated government in Canada at the national level, the Conservatives and the Liberals, because, of course, they think that they can hold out and then, they'll get a majority government again sometime in the future. So part of what needs to happen, and this is what's happened in other countries, is that one of those two major parties has to start to believe that the jig is up. And that they are no longer going to enjoy that kind of dominance. And we're already seeing those trends in this country. The difference between the 1950s through to the 80s was that those two parties would usually scoop up 85% of the votes in the country. Now they're down to 70% of the votes. And it's similar trends in the United Kingdom. And that bodes well, because one of the things that the more quantitative scholars show us is that the larger the party system, the greater the chance of the adoption of proportional representation. And there's a kind of common sense reason for that. It's just that parties start to think, whoops, I may become a big loser. And I don't want to become a big loser, so I better grab, half a loaf is better than nothing. So the continued weakness of one of our main governing parties, in this case is the Liberals, that's probably the best hope we have in this country, that we'll be able to edge towards a situation where a government will move on this. How should we actually make the decision? Well, that's where I think the citizens' assemblies have been one idea that's been footed as a way. But of course, New Zealand also used a royal commission. So, either of these approaches can get at the real question we need to answer, which is not what do people favor, what do people prefer, because most people don't know anything about voting systems. What we need to know is, what are people trying to do? What are they trying to do with their votes? And then which voting system will allow them to do it? It's a research question. And once we know that, we should just move to introduce that system.
All right. Thank all the panelists here. It's been a really good Q&A session here.
Do you want me to describe the U.S. prospects?
Oh yeah, did I forget you, Lee?
That's okay.
I started to skip ahead to the next section in my mind.
We're a little bit further behind here. We haven't had a political leader make a promise to eliminate first past the post, even if that leader went back on it. I think we're here in the U.S. We've been very prideful of our version of democracy for a long time, and there's been a slow awakening to the reality that maybe we don't have the best system of democracy in the world. I think there's a growing frustration with how our system works in a number of areas. So I think more and more people are open to change. I think what we will see in the next few years is a number of state level campaigns, such as the ProRep Coalition looking to bring this forward in California. I think you'll see some other states. The Progressive Caucus in the U.S. Congress has already issued a resolution in support of proportional representation. There are more groups in the U.S. Putting proportional representation into their advocacy program, and I think there's a slow way in which a lot of groups are coming around to realizing that this is a path forward, when it comes to civil rights groups, which have long relied on the Voting Rights Act for representation. I think there's a growing realization that that protection doesn't exist anymore, and that proportional districts would be a better way to ensure fair minority representation. And I think there is a growing sense that even at the elite level, that something is fundamentally broken in our political system, and that the aperture for thinking about major structural change is continuing to widen.
Okay. Thanks for jumping in there, Lee. I got a little bit ahead of myself. Thanks for taking the time to jump in and answer that. So we're going to move on now to some questions that we got from supporters. And because we have only, a pretty short period of time, we might only get to one or two questions. So I'm going to start with a question that comes up a lot, and I've seen a couple of versions of this already in the Q&A. So one of the major concerns people have is about the role and power of extremists and democratic backsliding. So I'd like to ask the panelists, how does the electoral system fit in with this? And what would you say to those who say proportional representation could give too much power to extremist politicians or extremist parties? And I'm going to start with Hannah.
I'd say that any system that's allowed a party to win on 33% of the vote, as I keep on mentioning, as Labour have, leaves us vulnerable to extremist capture. And anyway, first past the post managed to get through a very, I would say, extreme party anyway. Reform have been a very controversial party with policies that have been anti-immigration, and they did manage to win seats with first past the post. They've even won a seat in the London Assembly. So I think that kind of that argument falls flat, really, in terms of the reality of politics.
And I will move on to Dennis, extremist.
The difficulty with extremism, is everybody's idea of extremism may not be exactly the same. And sometimes parties that major parties don't like get called extremist. If we can agree that some parties are extremist, we can look at what has been the practice in countries using proportional systems, particularly in the post-war period. And it's really interesting because what the research shows is that, sure, PR allows, different parties to pop up. But if they don't reflect a considerable body of opinion, if they're not in line with some of what we call the valence attitudes, the attitudes that everyone shares in the country, then the other parties won't work with them. They become the third rail that no one will work with. And then what happens is that over time, the voters say, well, this isn't very effective. I'm not getting anything to happen. And so they abandon that party and they go back to supporting other parties. So, the idea that extremism, is, this is terrible. And so we should compromise our democratic system. We should put up barriers to democracy to prevent these undemocratic people from getting a foothold. That's not the way to go about things. What we need is a system that will guarantee that views that do not manage to resonate with a considerable number of people cannot gain total power over the system. And our first past the post system allows parties that come under the grip of extremist ideas to gain all the power and do all kinds of things. Whereas in a PR system, unless you can get parties that represent 50% plus one of the popular vote to go along with whatever you want, then you're not going to be able to do it. To me, that's the best protection. We get the best of both worlds. We get representation, even if sometimes we don't like what other people think. But at the same time, we have a protection against that influence having an outsized influence in our political system.
Well, here in the U.S., we have an extreme political party. It's called the Republican Party under the management of one Donald Trump. And if you went back to 2016 and looked at Donald Trump's support, he won the Republican primary, but he didn't win it overwhelmingly. So he got about as much support as AfD or any of the European far right parties. But by taking over one of the two major parties, he essentially radicalized and his supporters essentially radicalized that party. And now if you look at comparative party rankings, country experts put the U.S. Republican Party in the same league as AfD or National Rally, probably even further right than National Rally, as they've kind of tried to moderate a little bit.
Can you define, for those people who don't follow it as closely as us, can you tell them what AfD is? They probably don't know.
That's the Alliance for Deutschland. That's the far right party in Germany. So a lot of people will say, well, what about those extremist parties in Europe? Certainly they have some support, 20-25%, but it seems to kind of top out there. And none of the other major parties are willing to go into government with them. Sometimes there's a coalition government, but in order for that coalition government to form, the extremist parties have to moderate considerably, and usually that means that they lose support uh, because they've promised to radically change things. They're outsiders, and then they have to compromise, and then that undermines their base of support. So either you do the cordon sanitaire, which Dennis was talking about, where you just keep them out of government, or you bring them into a coalition, and that saps their power generally. Now, it doesn't always work. There are some countries where things become so polarized, and see in the comments people mentioning Israel, which is a distinct challenge. But when I think about Israel, I think, well, what would Israel look like with a two-party system? And I think that country would have long had an internal civil war had there been a two-party system there, and the country would be totally falling apart.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. And I mean, in Canada, when people say, well, PR could help elect, an extreme party, we don't have to look too far, see how First Past the Post is giving extreme views a lot of power just down south of us. So I really appreciate you saying that. I also want to say, too, that First Past the Post has polarized things to the point where each of our two main parties says the other party is an extremist. And a lot of their supporters believe that. Anybody who's not us is an extremist. So it's sort of, got a little looped. All right. So we have time, I think, for one more question. And it was really hard for me to pick from the different questions. So I'm going to put out one that I think a lot of people are wondering about. So all our countries are sort of in different places in terms of public awareness of this problem, public pressure on this issue. And I'd like to hear from the panelists on how they think that supporters can help to convince the public that there is a problem and mobilize the public to help address the problem. So this could be around mobilization, communication, advice to help so that we can help remedy this. And maybe I will start this time with Lee.
Yeah, so like I said, there's been a longstanding pride in America, in our system, the greatest democracy in the world, all that. So it's the idea that we might need some reform has come slowly. But I do think that the more dysfunctional our political system is, the more people are open to alternative voting systems. I mean, I certainly see more mentions of proportional representation, multi-member districts, the problems with the two-party system in conversation. So, the only way that you build support for change is by helping people understand that this is not inevitable, but this is a choice, and it's a choice that we continue to make by not changing the system. It's a challenge, but the more you talk about it, the more you raise the issue, the more people say, "Huh, oh, that's interesting."
So definitely bringing it up anywhere and everywhere.
Anywhere and everywhere. That's what I do.
All right. And then I will go to Hannah.
I think we're in an interesting place in Britain because we were so bruised after the divisiveness of Brexit that the conversations have already been happening about the need for change in our political system. And that conversation has been happening not just in the political landscape, but in schools, in places of work, We've got unions who are, very involved with the Labour Party, who have now been voting for the need for proportional representation. And when we've seen that kind of ground level of support, it's really making an impact for those people in charge and who are leading our country right now. Keir Starmer, who is currently our Prime Minister, had been questioned throughout the election campaign about his position on proportional representation. It was one of the issues that were coming up again and again during the election campaign itself. So this is why, I know that some people, I've been looking at the chat a little bit, that are not so sure whether we can get proportional representation in Britain, but we're closer than we've ever been before because of the conversations that we're having. And it is about the people at the end of the day, getting us to have, the moment I know that I can go and have a cup of tea with my friends and people will start talking about proportional representation, then I know we've made it. We've hit the mark that we need to do to get that real change. But I'm working incredibly hard with Make Votes Matter and making sure that all groups and all parts of society are talking about this. And for me, it will always be about the diverse groups, the minority groups. And if they really want to have a say in their politics, if they really want to be heard, we've got to fight together to make that change happen, because it's in the interest of everybody, particularly those groups, particularly the most vulnerable, particularly the ones who are going through the toughest time right now when we're going through a cost of living crisis. Those voices are so desperately needed to be heard right now, and we need to get that message out there for them.
Thank you, Hannah. So again, just reiterating, whatever connections you have in the community, use them. Use them to talk up proportional representation, and especially use them to connect the voting system to issues that people actually care about in their daily lives. So now I'd like to ask Dennis to address that.
Well, I've been working on this topic for over 35 years. So I've seen a lot of things rise and fall, and a lot of hopes lit and dashed, in that time. But what I've seen on the positive side of the ledger is that the idea that we would get over 400 people to come out to an event to talk about this topic absolutely would not have happened 3 decades ago. So things have changed. And I think that the people who are here today are really, the leaders on what we're trying to do. I want to start by saying you've got to moderate your expectations. The general public are not going to become voting system experts. They know very little about any of our institutions. And why should they? They're busy. They use these institutions hardly ever. So naturally, of course, they don't remember it all, or they're not that interested. What they need to know is why it's important. And so as you go out and you talk to them, I'm seeing all this chat that's going on amongst you that are here, and that's great. I just think that's so exciting. You're my kind of people. You want to talk about this kind of stuff and its impact, and that's great. But, you need to recognize that maybe everybody else isn't going to be quite as geeky as we are. And so you really you've got to craft your message to talk about the outcomes. What are the gets? What could people hope to accomplish by doing this? Not the minutia of the systems, not debates over which one's best, not all that stuff. But hey, if we make this change, it's going to have an impact on lives. Now, how do we do it? At the bottom line is you get parties to change the system. That's the simplest, most direct, and actually it's the punctuation mark, the exclamation mark for all of the processes, because all the processes require politicians to make the change. The problem is pushing them to make that change. And we do that by getting involved with political parties, getting involved with civil society organizations. It's difficult. And I can tell you, in looking at over 150 years of reform, sometimes the reform comes up when you least expect it. It comes up through accident, through a confluence of events that no one could have predicted. But because you were there, because you were ready, because you had already got some stuff ready to hustle out there, you were able to take advantage of it. So that would be my advice to those of you here today. I know it's frustrating in these webinars. I see all these questions. I know you want answers. And if you want to write to me, just Google me. I'm happy to, find my institutional address. You're welcome to contact me with any questions you want. But take heart in the fact that there's so many of you here today, and you've got opportunities to join the organizations that are represented here. So that would be my most immediate advice: is join these groups, and join other groups. And I just saw a talk by this really fantastic American Democratic reformer, Marshall Gantz, and Gantz talks about the way in which we can build up policies through communities, through social movements, through house meetings, connecting with people, seeing them, seeing what they want, seeing what their problems are, and connecting it to our issue. So I would recommend, for those of you who maybe don't want to do the political party route, on a leafleted tables, there are lots of other ways in which you could try to move this issue forward.
All right, that is a great note to end this webinar on. I want to thank the other two organizations for asking, for helping put this together, for asking me to host it. If any of you are wondering how come we're not hearing anything from Caledon and Alberta, it's not because I'm trying to exclude them, it's because we decided to have one person ask the question so it didn't get really confusing, and because we only have an hour. So hopefully next time it'll be one of the possibly one of the two gentlemen that are on the screen with me. I'd like to thank the ProRep Coalition and Make Votes Matter, and all three of our guests, Lee, Hina, and Dennis, for taking your time to share your expertise and your passion for proportional representation with us. I'd like to, and I especially everyone who joined us, because you are the ones who are going to take what you heard and take this back out into your community, bring it up with groups that you belong to, bring it up at the coffee shop, join your local organization, help us push this forward. We don't give up. The main thing we can all do for each other is don't give up. We will only fail when we give up. So as you log out today, you will be directed to a page asking if you'd like to support the organization in your country. I'd encourage you to do that and to get involved as a volunteer if you can. Thank you very much, and we'll sign off for now. Thanks, everyone.